Hello, my name is Thomas Schuttenhelm, and I am the Artistic Director at Network for New Music. On Friday, February 21st at 7:30 p.m. at the Peter A. Benalil Germantown branch of the Settlement Music School, the Network Ensemble will be premiering Switch Slides, a featured commission for our 40th anniversary year by composer Eliza Brown. And today, on this installment of Conversations with Composers, we welcome Eliza into the discussion about their career and to learn more about their piece, Switch Slides. Great to see you, Eliza.
Good to see you too, Thomas.
Thanks for joining us today. We're looking forward to having you here in Philadelphia in person in just a few weeks for the premiere. But this is a bit of a homecoming for you because aren't you a Philadelphian?
Yes. So yes, I was born in Bryn Mawr. I grew up in Philadelphia. My parents still live in Mount Airy. And yeah, so it's a homecoming in that sense. And also Network for New Music has been a part of my musical life for a long time. When I was a teenager, I would go to network concerts, and that was some of the first access I had to live performances of new music. And then this will be, I think, the third time that I've written a piece for network. So it's a homecoming in that sense too.
Yeah, and I'm really pleased that you are a part of our featured commission for the 40th anniversary because it makes it extra special for both of us that we have someone who has really grew up with hearing network and how that influenced you. I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about like your coming to be a composer.
Sure. Yeah, so I started music training when I was 7 years old, when I started learning the cello. And I started composing right around the same time. Um, and my mother attributes this to at the school that I went to, they had a thing about writing words, which was if you read, you write. And so she has this idea that I just applied that to learning music. Oh, well, if you play, you compose.
And
Uh,
that's a little bit unique, isn't it, for standard training? Most instrumentalists don't make that leap until much later.
Yeah, and I think that has a lot to do. I think there's something to my mom's analysis. I think that has a lot to do with just sort of how music making is presented, that if it's presented that creation is normal at all levels, and you internalize that, then it doesn't feel like it's something quote unquote more advanced to be creating versus performing.
And I'm just curious, what are some of your earliest pieces that are still in your catalog?
Yes. So there is a vocal canon
Mhm.
that is called the mole song, as in the animal that digs in the
Mhm.
ground. And the mole song is a three-part canon, um, and it is still regularly performed at the Walden School summer program for young musicians, where I went as a student and have since taught there and been part of their academic leadership team. And it's still part of that community, and people from that community have also taught it to other places. So that piece is still making the rounds in the world. It's probably my most performed piece, honestly.
Now, you and I share an affinity for Lee Hyla's music.
Yes.
I think we're both similarly impressed with We Speak Etruscan, and I think that was an important piece to you. It's certainly an important piece to me. I just love that. Can you tell us a little bit more about how like hearing that piece or hearing music inspires you to further your creativity?
Yeah. Well, Lee was one of my teachers at Northwestern in graduate school before he passed away. And I had actually gotten to know his music much earlier. I heard We Speak Etruscan when I was a teenager, and at that time, that piece sort of so expanded my sense of like the musical language that was possible, with sort of classical instruments in a situation where most people have classical training, that it was sort of like it sort of was like this thing that sort of hovered in front of me like a problem I needed to solve in the long term because I had not sort of cracked on hearing it, what was happening here and what made it so electric. So it's a piece I thought about for a long time, and I think little bits of its language very slowly sort of made their way into my language. And I think that's been true of, yeah, pieces that have been influential to me sort of often appear as like this sort of conundrum I can't quite grasp or figure out what it's going to mean to me, and that has to be worked out over time.
Yeah, for anybody who doesn't know Lee's music, please check it out. It's really, really quite incredible music and probably an underrated composer in terms of, really should be represented more on programs. So I was so pleased that we have that connection. Um, for the piece switch slides in the program note, you wrote that the source sounds were, and I love this, were noisy, slidey, switchy electric guitar sounds. So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that concept of noisy, slidey, switchy.
Um, Totally, yeah. One of my favorite ways to work is in collaboration with performers. I rarely want to go sort of sit in a room by myself and come up with an idea in a vacuum. So you and I had some conversations and started talking about sort of things that the electric guitar is good at and like how that might interface with some of the very early ideas I had about the piece. And you sent me these lovely recordings of little sound samples that I spent time with. And yeah, I found that the things I was gravitating toward, were these sounds that I could describe in these very sort of non-musical terminology ways, like, oh, this is slidey. This is slidey in a different way. This is slidey and noisy. This is very noisy and only a little bit slidey. So I started sort of applying compositional logic, if you will, to these concepts that for me are fun. Like it's fun to be like, new. um, but then it's interesting. I mean, at least for me, like I could sit around and be like, new for a long time, but like maybe not for 3 months while I'm writing a piece. So I want to start thinking about that in more kind of detailed ways and being like, okay, well, how does every instrument go new in like a sort of idiomatic way? And if they can't, then how can I approximate that? And then we start getting sort of like pixelated slides. Well, what's a pixelated slide? It's a scale. um, and so then we start getting into development of material coming from this very sort of fun, like gestural instinct, and opening that out into like, how could this develop as a composition?
Well, I've certainly been having great fun playing with all of your switchy, slidey, noisy parts. But it's not the first time you've written for the electric guitar. So I listened rather carefully to In Ora Morstris Nostrae, right?
Mhm,
Which I think was, and what I loved about that is like there's an austerity to the beginning of that. And then you move into this like harmonics where it gets a little bit more melodic and pulsing. And then that part also has a lot of glissandi in it, I think. And then the ending is really, really climactic.
yes.
All these things that I admired that I was, when I commissioned you, I was hoping, oh, I hope they put this into our new piece. But then you develop that even more in the body of the state,
Mhm,
which I hear the chord swells in there, like the chord swells that go to a chop staccato,
mhm, mhm.
and also that whammy bar effect and that wonderful wide vibrato in there. So I'm just wondering, could you like this is a real development of your experience with the instrument. So take
Mhm,
us through that, like your thinking for the guitar, and especially the electric guitar, uh,
mhm.
which is, now I think has a more prominent place in the contemporary ensemble. So tell us a little bit about the kind of like this now trilogy of works, which,
Yeah.
which uses the guitar.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I have actually not written for classical guitar. I've only written for electric guitar. And I think that that partly comes out of just sort of the community I was in at the time when I started including guitar in my pieces. I was living in Chicago. I was very interconnected with Ensemble Daliente. Um, and so Jesse Langen, who's the guitarist of Ensemble Daliente, is just an amazing collaborator. And
And a wonderful guitar player and musician,
yes,
just really great
yes,
thinker and interpreter of music. Yeah.
yeah, all of the above. And so I was hearing, their concerts. I was working with and talking to Jesse. And I think I sort of developed a lot of my electric guitar mentality from that. It was a point in time when Fausto Romatelli's music was
Uh,
also
yeah.
pretty, forefront in the new music world. And so there's some great electric guitar writing in there that is both idiomatic, like you can hear the relationships to, rock and metal and whatnot, but is also, being used in these like really long form, like intense contemporary music pieces. So yeah, I think that's a lot of where my use of the instrument comes from, where it's this amazing sound machine. Uh, and I'm
What
interested in both sort of this is an amazing sound machine, divorced from any history and context, but then also there's so many points of reference.
Mhm.
And so I'm interested in that kind of duality of like pure sound generator thing that is very embedded in cultural understanding.
What I think distinguishes the part in switch slides is the nuanced use of distortion, which is the I think part of your noisy part, right? And just I'm wondering, like, tell us a little bit more about that as a timbre of sound in there, which you're right. I mean, it does sort of have a cultural reference. But it is also, we know from another, the noise element and noise music, it's so important to that genre as well. And your piece is very much mediates between this. So tell us a little bit more about your use of distortion in Switch Slide.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm someone who like really loves the gamut of sounds. And so for me, distortion is like a pretty delightful sound. Um, and I'm also interested in kind of thinking about sound on a spectrum from like acoustic simplicity to acoustic complexity. And distortion is at like such an extreme of acoustic complexity. There's a lot of, you know, waves of sound that have complex mathematical relationships vibrating the air. And so I enjoy like the visceral feeling of that.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that in this piece, I'm thinking, just as I'm thinking about kind of how does the idea of a glissando like translate to these different instruments and be a piece of material that I can develop, I'm thinking about distortion in a similar way. So
Yeah.
like, how can a string instrument produce distortion-like sounds, or how can this ensemble as a group create distortion-like sounds, or very sort of clean, pure sounds, and everything in between, and like using that spectrum as one of the main parameters that the piece is toggling around within.
Yeah. And for our listeners and audience, the one thing I want to point out is that, unlike other pieces where distortion is sort of on off, it's this binary thing. You've got me adjusting the distortion throughout the piece, which I think is really, really interesting and fascinating. Um, could you just talk us through either, what does your compositional process look like from the time you have either the commission or the idea that you're going to do this piece to the rehearsals that you step into and guide the players through to the premiere? Could you just talk us through that process?
Totally, yeah. I think so. I am a big proponent, and I talk about this with my students, of like at any point in the process, there are some things that you know about how the piece is going to be, and there's some things that you don't know. Uh, and I'm a big proponent of getting what you know out of your brain and onto paper in whatever format that takes. So sometimes that's writing down words of like, this is my plan, this is what I know might happen. Sometimes it might be sort of figuring out a process, of developing the material, like making a chart, for example, of like, here's 5 different ways I can, use this idea. Sometimes it might mean like literally going and writing material into the score, in a sort of more linear way, like what we might traditionally think composing is. Sometimes it's working with instruments. And so throughout my process, I'm usually kind of circling around among all of these different ways of figuring out the answers to the next questions that need to be answered. Um, and then when we get to rehearsal, I love rehearsal. I like coming in and really trying to understand sort of what is the ensemble making of this piece, like before I sort of come in and I'm like, here's how it's gonna be. Um, yeah, because at that point, it's also like, what happens when this is out of my hands and what can other people bring to it that I might not have expected? So yeah, I like this kind of circular collaborative approach.
I have a couple of follow-up questions. But this notion of curiosity is built into the score, isn't it? Because you in your program notes, you have this question, what would happen if the music does
Hmm.
fly?
Hmm. Yeah,
And
right. So in this particular piece, Um, this is not true every time, but I just wanted this piece to be fun. I wanted it to be fun for me to write. I wanted the musical result to be fun, which, not everyone's fun is the same. So some people might hear this and be like, that's not how I define fun. But I hope that at least for some folks it will seem kind of fun. Um, yeah, so I kept just sort of allowing myself to ask the question, like this sort of gleeful, like, ooh, what if we did this next? What if we did this next? Um, so there was some sort of, this is often true of my process where I'm kind of toggling between also very sort of like formalist ways of thinking and then very sort of like open-ended, like ultimately what we're doing is a form of play. Like, ooh, what if we make this weird sound on the piccolo? Ooh. Um, yeah, like that versus like, oh, and then the other day I made a chart.
I love the fun is definitely part of it. I'm certainly having fun with it, and I'm doing the same thing with my part. I'm going, well, what if I did it this way? Well, what if I did it that way? And what if I did it here? So I know that because you put that into the score in the preface, I'm using that as an invitation to keep playing and constantly approaching it with new eyes and fresh ears. So
Yeah.
I'm having great fun with it. But I'm also curious, do you use any computer software in your composition? Do you use paper, a combination of, because you mentioned charts, and how does that combine into the final score?
Yes. So the score itself is notated in Sibelius. This score has a few elements that are also hand drawn. There's little bits of graphic notation, just kind of like long-term glissandi with shapes over time that it's easier to just draw than to try to force Sibelius to want to make those lines. Yeah, I work, again, it's this very cyclic thing. Like some parts of the process, it's easiest to get down on paper. I have a beautiful notebook made by a visual artist friend, Antonia Contro, that is like my initial ideas notebook right now. So some things are like text written in this beautiful notebook, manuscript paper. I like using really big manuscript paper,
Um,
so where I can just sort of treat it like a splatterboard of ideas.
yeah.
And yeah, like getting things into an actual score format is kind of later in the process for me. But even then, once I'm working in the score, I'll get out of there sometimes because it can be constraining, like just the size of the screen and seeing the boxes of the measures. Um, you know, I'm someone who wants to go like like I gotta go do that, and then I can put everything into boxes for the sake of reading.
Yeah. And let's also let everyone know that this is a rather large piece, right? So we've got flute and piccolo, B flat clarinet, along with the electric guitar, then violin, viola, cello, and double bass. So just curious, what drew you to that particular combination?
Yeah. Um, I like juicy chords. Um, and the single line instruments there, so flute, clarinet, string family. Those are all instruments that can blend well together, um, and cover a huge amount of register. I like to have a really big registral arsenal. Like this is a Lee Hyla thing that we talked about a lot when I was studying with him, but just sort of managing registral trajectories over time, I think is really powerful for creating form. So yes, so I wanted to have that blend, that register, all the harmonic possibilities. Those are also all instruments that have a huge amount of timbral variety available to them and a huge amount of dynamic range. And
Yeah.
so I'm a string player, like I'm just drawn to the kind of flexibility and nuance that that group of instruments provides.
I'm glad you said it because I hadn't thought of it that way because in my particular part for the electric guitar part, you have me playing the full range of the instrument. And I mean full in terms of I'm using the whammy bar to detune my strings. So it goes lower than the lowest string is possible. And then I'm playing the highest possible note on the fretboard and even beyond that because I'm touching the thing. So that I love that when you were talking about the full expanse, because you apply that both to the ensemble and to the particular instruments.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
those timbres are just going to sparkle, I think, and crackle with sound.
Yes. Yeah. And that's I don't know, I'm really interested in sort of the ways that different musical parameters influence one another. And I think it's one of the exciting things about writing for instruments, writing for ensembles. It's like register is timbre. Like it's pitch, and pitch is also timbre. And so it's like, yeah, the sort of alchemy of all of these things. But I'm usually thinking about the interplay of all of those things at once.
And since you had mentioned like this open curiosity component, and then you were talking about the formalist component, and I think you do put them together in a very rigorous way that has a lot of integrity to it. And I think I'm seeing you in your office. Is that right? At
Yes,
DePaul? So
this is my office at DePauw. Welcome.
I wanted to ask you, like, how is your teaching at DePaul shaped your compositional development?
Yeah. I mean, I think to think about that, I might just sort of extend it to teaching in general, not just teaching here. I've been teaching music in some capacity since I was 23. I like Network for New Music, just turned 40. So, yeah.